Hey guys, welcome to another Maya tutorial. I haven't posted a tutorial in a while, busy with school and stuff, but I'm back. Um, Today I'm going to be showing you how to do some cool effects with end particles. And basically, your end product will look something like this. So as you can see, they're kind of streaky, which is kind of cool. So I'll be showing you how to do that, and I'll be showing you how to make some modifications on it that can make it a little cooler depending on what you're trying to do. But yeah, you should be able to make some cool particle streaks after you've watched this tutorial. So let's get started. First thing to do is to make a new scene. So let's do that. Don't save. And obviously the first thing we're going to need is a particle emitter. So just go to End Particles, create emitter, then go with the default settings, which should just create an Omni emitter, which will do fine. Just one thing that you should note is this is the emitter that's going to be spawning the particles that will cast the streaks, so unless you want 100 streaks at once, I would suggest turning this down to a much lower value, usually less than 10 for 10 itself. I'm going to go with 5 just for now, so this needs more interactive. So let's set this to 5. Other things we're going to do that you don't necessarily have to do are go into Nucleus 1, and if ground plane, use plane is checked, uncheck it. You can leave it checked, but personal preference of mine not to have the ground plane there. And the other thing that I'm going to turn off is under the shape node, make sure you turn this on. Again, you don't have to, but I just don't like having the solver gravity on because it makes it harder to work with. But I'll show you some things we can do with that later. Anyway, so let's get started. Let's get a few more frames. 500 should be good. Hit play. So you'll see some particles flowing out. Cool. Let's go into shaded mode. I'm using Maya 2014, so it gives you these pop-ups. Basically, it's just spawning some particles. They're not falling. They're not hitting the ground plane. Kind of boring. Whatever. So basically, what we're going to do is we're going to have these particles spawn the streaks of particles. But obviously, if they're just moving like this, there's not going to be very much for an interesting streak pattern happening. So let's create something to get them moving. You can use a radial field or a vortex field or a Newton field. They all, basically make them move in different ways. I'm going to go with this radial field and just put it close to the emitter, and then we can watch what happens. As you can see, the particles get accelerated away from the center. It's pretty cool. Just to make things easier, I would suggest opening up the side pane of the outliner, because that'll make it easier to click on your different particle shapes and fields and emitters. So anyway, with this done, that's actually pretty much all we have to do for the first emitter. If you were able to see in the previous thing I showed you, I had particles emitting particles. So what you should do is select End Particle 1, then go to End Particles again, and hit Emit from Object. This will cause the first particle system to emit a secondary set of particles. If we play this, you can see exactly what's happening there. That doesn't look so great. So here's a few things we need to do. If you want to be able to differentiate between your two sets of particles, the first thing you can do is color them differently. So let's go under End Particle 2, and we'll go to Shading. So if you open up the shading folder, a whole bunch of stuff comes out. Let's just make all of them yellow. Cool. Now the other thing we want to do is make these not collide with our first set of particles, or at least not at this state. So that's going to be under Collisions. Turn off Self Collide, and might as well do Self Collide because we're going to make a trail. And similarly to how we did for the first set of particles, turn on Ignore Solver Gravity. Then you'll get this happening, and you can see particles are forming trails, which is pretty cool so far. So if that's the only effect you wanted, I guess you're good to go. But anyway, moving on, a couple things we should do. Probably scale these particles down. I scale them to about 0.4, or 0.03 or 0.04. Let's go with 0.035. Makes them smaller, makes things look a little better. Now if you notice, the trails here are kind of diffuse and wide. It's actually okay if you want to do that. The important thing to do here, so we don't get this giant blob in the center, is to click on the first set of particles, so n particle 1, and go to n particles per point emission rates. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to control how much each particle from the n particle 1 set, how many particles of the n particle 2 set it emits. So we're going to be able to control how many particles are emitted by each particle. That's handy. So go to per particle array attributes, because it's going to be a per particle attribute. And you can already see it has an output, and obviously it's just going to the rate on the second emitter. So we're going to make a runtime before dynamics expression. And basically a cool thing to do is to make the rate of emission proportional to the velocity of the emitting particle. And to do that, basically just write the following expression: n particle shape 1, or actually let's just copy and paste it from up here. And what we want to do is we want to set that equal to the velocity, shape 1 dot velocity. And this attribute is actually a per particle attribute, so it will emit particles based on the velocity of each parent particle. So let's create that and see what happens. Rewind. Now play again. If you take a look at it, you'll see that there's not really many particles being emitted until they start moving faster, which is cool. So let's stop that. Two things you probably want to do at this point are set lifetimes on particles, so you don't have them living forever and really clogging up your scene. So first thing to do is set it for the main particles. Let's just set that to random range. Let's do like 6 for lifespan and 2 for lifespan random. So that basically means they'll live for a random amount between 6 and 8 seconds. We want to do this for the second particle system as well. However, you want to create a new solver for these particles. Otherwise, for some reason, Maya can bug out and things don't work properly. So select n particle shape 2, and then go over to n solver, assign solver, new solver. And that's just so things keep working down the line and don't totally bug out. Anyway, going back to n particle 2, we can now set pretty much just a constant lifespan. 1.5 seconds should be fine. So let's look at our effect now. You can see the emitted particles are dying, and the main set of particles also die. Cool. That said, one thing we can already notice is that the streaks are kind of too diffuse, which doesn't really look great. So let's open up our expression again. I'm just going to go and do it this way. And let's just multiply this by some value. Let's say 6. Oops, 6 times that. And just hit edit. And now basically the rate of particle emission from each particle is going to be 6 times its velocity. Playing that, you can see we're definitely getting a lot more in terms of particles now. At this point, your scene will probably become less interactive because it's starting to get a little heavy. Obviously, if you increase that number more, it's going to get even heavier. But what you can start to see is we're getting an effect that looks pretty reasonable. One thing you can do here that may be more of your liking to get a more clean, concentrated streak is to change the emitter type on the second set of particles. So go to emitter 2 and change it to directional. And you can see what happens now. They're definitely coming out in much more of a straight line pattern. The one thing that's happening though is that all the trails seem to be blowing over that way, and that's just because we have the speed attribute set on this directional emitter. So if you turn that down to 0 and replay, you'll see that the trails stay perfectly in place. which, depending on what you're doing, again, can work out pretty well. Alright, so with that done, we basically have the fundamentals for the trails. Ooh, whoa. And now we can just start adding cool little effects to them. So first thing we can do is add some interesting effect to the emitted particles, or the first set of particles, because changing the way those move will change the shape of the trails, which can be interesting. So to do that, we're going to go to Fields again, and we're going to create a turbulence field. Turbulence fields are really nice for adding, you know, not random, but eccentric motions to the particles. So let's turn the magnitude of that up quite a bit, actually, because the particles are moving pretty far away, and turn the attenuation down. If you don't know what these do, magnitude is basically the strength, and attenuation is like the fall off as a function of distance. So let's play with that, and you can see we're getting some interesting effects already happening here. But all the particles seem to be blowing in this one direction, which is kind of crappy. To fix that, you can go back to end particle shape 1 and look at its emitter, and let's just change the min and max distance on that. So let's change the min distance to like 0.2 and the max distance to around 1. Same thing is happening. Sometimes you just need to make it even larger. There we go. Now they're kind of blown in more random directions. It's cool. And if you look at the tails, you can see they're kind of curling around, which is a nice little effect. As they move further away, they're curling less, but that's because the turbulence field is affecting it less because it's more attenuated. If you want them to curl all the time, then turn the attenuation way down. And keep going from there. If you turn it down to 0, you're going to get some crazy things happening, so you might want to be careful there. But now you have these cool little swimming trails. So if that's what you want to do, that's pretty cool. But what you'll notice is that as these yellow particles, die off, they kind of just pop out, and that doesn't look so great. So now we're going to play around with the shading of these yellow particles. To do that, select those particles, go under their shape node, and we're going to go back under shading. So back into the shading tab, what we want to do is we want to change two things. The opacity is the one that's going to make it look really nice as they fade out. So let's do that. Basically, you just want to drag it down this negatively decreasing line, and then leave opacity scale input as age. And that basically means as the particles age, make them, fade out to transparent. Which if we take a look at now, we can see that they're definitely fading out, which looks good. What you should do, though, is change your input max to whatever you set the lifespan of these particles to be. That'll make it look nicer, because you won't have a bunch of just transparent particles at the end that you can't even see. So set that to whatever we set it to, which is 1.5, or whatever you set it to. And what you'll get is particles that fade out very cleanly. So back here we have transparent Back here we have transparent particles, and up at the front they're fully opaque, which looks pretty nice. Now if you don't want it to fade out linearly across the edge of the particles, you can change the interpolation, and then just put another point in here somewhere, depending on what you want it to do. This will cause it to be more opaque until right at the end, and then it'll fade way out pretty quickly. So it's kind of extreme, so maybe something more like this is better. Alright, and now the other thing that I want to do is just basically play with the incandescence, because that's what's going to make it look like a cool effect. So first thing we need to do for that is look at our rendering. So to do that, let's open up our render settings. I'm using Maya 2014, so it's going to be slightly different. I'm going to render it in Mental Ray. You can render with Maya software too, but I just like how Mental Ray works a little better. So go to Quality, and since I'm using Maya 2014, it has this unified sampling mode, which actually works a lot better than the original sampling ray tracer mode, because in the sampling ray tracer mode, sometimes what would happen is some of the particles wouldn't appear because it wasn't being sampled enough. In unified sampling, that doesn't really happen. So these settings are okay. I'm going to turn this down to like 16, and then for some reason it has the reflections up really high, so I'm going to turn that down too. The next thing to do is to look at a render. And if you look at it, we have these nice decaying trails. But what we want is probably things that look a little better than that. And to do that, we're going to work with the incandescence. So let's start playing with that. I think a cool color scheme might be one that fades from like turquoise to, turquoise mixed with a bit of green. And again, we're going to change this to age as well. Change that to 1.5. And now we have particles that kind of fade like that. And I'm going to turn the color down to black just so only the incandescence shows up. Well, that's kind of cool. Do another quick render. Not bad. Alright, continuing on, what else can we do here? One thing that people really like to put in all their particle effects is glow. And to do that, basically, the easiest way is to open up your Hypershade. Let's make this a little bigger so we can see what we're doing. And what we want to play with is the NP Balls Blend. That's the default shader created for the particles, and that's where we're going to be able to give them glow. So click on that, and just go to Special Effects, Glow Intensity, and set that to 0.15 maybe. Okay, do another render. And we have glowing particles. Note that glow is a post-processing effect, so there's not a whole lot of control over it aside from this one little slider, and a lot of people do it in post. So you don't necessarily have to put glow on, but I know a lot of people would probably like to do it. So anyway, moving on. With this, what can we do? The next step is to probably make these trails a little more interesting. And to do that, we can change the way they move. Again, we can set it back to the omni pattern that we had before from the emitted particles. So let's set that to omni again, under end particle, under emitter 2. And what we see is they're kind of in streaks again. And to fix that, basically all we need to change is the speed again. Now we have those happening. The thing I like to do though is actually a little different. So I'm going to change it back to a directional emitter and make sure all the things are back as they were. And what I think looks really cool is adding a turbulence field to these particles. If you've been paying attention, you've noticed that the fields we put on our first set of particles is not affecting the smaller particles. So what we can do is we can actually add a field specifically to the smaller particles, and I think a turbulence field works really well. So I'm going to generate another one, move it up. I'm going to turn the magnitude on this one a little higher, attenuation down, not as much as the first one, but you'll see what happens. Now let's replay the animation and see what happens. What you can see is the trail is decaying with time and kind of spraying the particles everywhere, which I think looks a lot cooler, and in your renders it will look pretty cool. Obviously you can do this with the omni emitters too. So anyway, that done. the last things we can look at are just kind of, what else we can do here. Like I said, you can set it to Omni, and that'll get you a cool effect. But the other thing you can do is add a particle gold to these particles, the big particles. You could add a particle gold to the smaller particles, and that might get you some really interesting effects. But if we just take a look at the render of these particles, I think you'll see that it looks a lot nicer with the turbulence added. Obviously, you can batch render out an animation and, have some really nice glow effects going for you. Another cool thing to do is adding something like a vortex field to get them spinning and, all that stuff, but I'll leave that up to you guys. One thing that I sometimes like to do is play with turning on gravity and the ground plane again. So if we turn on gravity for these particles, we're going to get some interesting effects. So uncheck ignore solver gravity for the small particles and replay the animation. You'll see that they're accelerating downward, as we would expect for particles affected by gravity. And if you want to, you could turn on the use ground plane, but you'll get a bunch of particles pooling at the bottom and weird things happening if the big particles are going under the ground plane. You can also turn on gravity for these guys, but they're kind of just going to bounce on the ground and do weird things. And the one thing you can do if you want more particles emitted, obviously, is just increase the emitter 2 rate per particle. The one you create an expression for. You can change this to, again, doubling it. Or you can, make your own expressions that are much more complicated. This is an expressions tutorial, though, so I'm not going to get into that. But obviously, as you emit more particles, the heavier your scene gets. So be aware of that. And rendering this out, we'll get another different look. One thing to note is that if you don't want the main particles showing up at all, like if you just wanted the trails, it's a pretty easy thing to do. You just have to go under their shape node and go to render stats and uncheck primary visibility and then sheave shadows and cast shadows as well, because you're not going to want them to do that either. If you don't want them to glow but you want them to be visible because they're instanced or not instanced, because you just want them to show, what you can do is assign another shader to these particles only, and then just connect the respective connections. You can look at the hypershade and see all that stuff, though. So yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. If you want to get a more diffuse trail, you can obviously switch to Omni, or you can play with the spread attributes on the directional emitter and the min and max distance again. The easiest way is probably to just use the Omni, though. And that's going to get you a cool thing, especially with the turbulence field added. I'm going to turn gravity back off real quick. And yeah, basically that's how you can create cool particle trails. If you want to do more advanced stuff, obviously you can use expressions and all that stuff, but that's a tutorial for another day. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them. You can render out these batch render out a sequence, post it on YouTube, and show me what you did. Yeah, any questions I'm cool to answer, but I hope you guys learned something. I'll see you in the next tutorial.